First ice on Mille Lacs Lake. It's a period of a lot of buzz and excitement. You know, everybody's been waiting for this time. They're itching to get out on the lake. And typically this time kicks off right around Thanksgiving weekend. It could be a little bit earlier, it could be a little bit later. It just depends on the season and the ice conditions themselves.
Have fish.
Take a look at that pig.
Okay, let's get him.
For me, what defines first ice is basically limited accessibility. Just as the name implies, first ice is right at the beginning. It's when you first get out on the lake. It's what I consider the time even before early ice. First ice is when you're walking out onto the lake. It's generally late November or early December, and you're just getting out there. You're keeping the spud bar in front of you. You're checking the ice in front of you. You have your ice picks on, you're wearing your cleats, and you're just making your way out there and getting to the first spots that are near the access. Now, even with the limitations of first ice, there are still some very incredible opportunities at this time. One of my favorite things to do in ice fishing takes place right at first ice within the first couple weeks of walkable ice. It's something I look forward to every year at this time, and it really is a rush when it comes to fishing because it's very different than what you're normally used to. And what that is sight fishing. And you know, I started this years ago. I heard about guys doing it. You know, a lot of you have heard of spear fishing, where you cut a big spear hole in the ice and you wade over the top of it with a decoy, and when a pike comes in, you spear them. But a lot of people haven't actually tried the sight fishing part. So instead of spearing, all you're doing is you're replacing the spear with the fishing rod, and you're just trying to angle pike instead of spearing them. What I like about this method is I can release fish. And you know, years ago, Mille Lacs is known for having a big population of really big northerns. Some real gators were coming out of here. And that's still the case. There are some big northerns in Mille Lacs. Not to the numbers that there were a decade ago, but there's still some really great opportunity out here to get on some really big fish, 40-inch plus pike. Now, while that may be my main draw at this time, there's also a couple other really good fishing opportunities as well to kind of break up the day. Those two other opportunities that I go for this time of year at first ice is perch and walleye. Now, the perch, as long as there's sunlight out, you're going to be able to catch perch. Now, most of them in the bays at this time, first ice, are going to be real small fish, mini perch. But they keep you busy in between pike. And if you really stick with it over the course of the day, you can definitely get a meal of some keeper-sized fish. The third opportunity that I go for is kind of an evening thing. So after the sight fishing kind of wanes down and you can no longer see down the hole anymore, when it starts to really get dark down there, that's when you'll notice the little white tips start to move in. Especially if you key up on certain areas in the bays, you'll notice a lot more walleyes moving in. Now, some days it happens a little earlier in the afternoon and you can literally watch them come in and you can sight fish walleyes, and that's super cool. Other days it takes a little bit longer. Sometimes it's very hard to see them down there when they actually start moving. But either way, that last part of the day, that evening, late afternoon, sunset bite, that typically kind of rounds out your day and provides you a flurry of activity to get in on some evening walleyes right before you wrap things up. Now, first ice poses some unique challenges, and what I would say the biggest one is accessibility and mobility. When you're simply walking out, it can be a lot of work. You know, when you have glare ice on the bays at first ice, pulling a fish house isn't such a big deal. You can walk around pretty easily, but even with like an inch or even a half inch of snow, just a dusting of snow on the lake can really make hauling that fish house a lot of work. So being efficient kind of becomes more the name of the game when it comes to early ice. And if you're going to be doing the sight fishing thing like I like to do, cutting the big spear holes, you really want to be extra efficient, because simply going out and drilling a bunch of holes is not going to happen because cutting the spear holes is a process in itself. So you want to be efficient and understand where you're going to set up. You want a game plan when you go out. You can move 2 or 3 times when you're doing the sight fishing thing, but you're not going to go out and drill 100 holes when you're doing this. It's just simply too much work. And you're not going to be able to move around easily enough to make that a thing either. So you really want to get a map, and you want to get things kind of narrowed down before you hit the lake. So you want to have a location in mind. What I recommend doing on early ice is finding the best weed line that you can, on first ice I mean, is finding the best greenest cabbage you can. And typically you're going to find that around 10 feet of water. The best cabbage lines, you're going to find a nice distinct drop off. It's going to be around 10 feet of water, and that's where you're going to see the hardest lines of cabbage. Now when you find that cabbage, you want to look around and try to find the greenest stuff that you can. If you're out early enough before the snow hits the lake, I really recommend getting out before that first snowfall and looking around, because you can see through the ice and you can see where the greenest cabbage is. A lot of times in the bays you'll find that they freeze up on a calm night, so the ice is pretty clear a lot of years, and you can simply walk around and look through it and find the good green cabbage. So finding that green cabbage, that's going to be key. The second thing I look for is, if you really want to get things lined up and zeroed in, is trying to find where that green cabbage meets a hard bottom. Now a lot of people think of the bays as just being mucky areas in the lake that are full of weeds and there's not a whole lot of diversity in them. And that's simply not the case. Each and every one of the bays on this lake has areas of rock piles. It has areas of harder bottom such as gravel. They also have areas of sand. And you'll find that stuff sometimes by looking through for weed types. If you're walking around on the ice, you can see through the ice and you can see different weed types and possibly distinguish what kind of bottom it is there. If you go out and do a little scouting before season, you can use your boat and you can find the harder bottom areas or the rocky bottom areas. But either way, finding those hard bottom areas are going to be key. If you can't see through the ice and you are too late in the season, you can't put your boat in there to go do some scouting, what I recommend doing is looking at a map and trying to find a point that extends out into the bay. A lot of times they'll be very subtle, but any point that sticks out into the bay almost every time is going to be a harder bottom than the surrounding bottom. So what I like to do is I like to find where that weed line is, about 10 feet of water, where it joins up to that point that extends out into the bay. That's going to be a very, very high percentage area, and that's going to give you the best action. A lot of times you'll find that the pike, they don't necessarily care about the hard bottom. It can be more attractive to them, definitely can, but a lot of times you'll notice that they cruise up and down the weed line, so it's not as important for them. The perch, they'll be wherever there's green weeds. You'll find perch, a lot of times it seems like the perch are everywhere. The real key though is, if you want to get on that last end of the day bite, that flurry of walleyes, you're really going to want to be on that harder bottom. That's where a lot of those walleyes are going to move to right in the evening. That's where you're going to have your best flurries. That's where you're going to have your best evening bite. So if you want to get zeroed in, find the hardest weed line you can and find where it joins up to a hard bottom. That's where you're going to have the best opportunities at the most different species. Tip-ups are another great option at this time. They really help you cover water. I kind of think of it as trapping on ice. You can put tip-ups wherever you like. You can put them out in the deep area in the middle of the bay. You can put them up into the shallows on a shallow rock pile. You'll be surprised where you catch fish. And the cool thing about a tip-up is tip-ups are stealth. You set it up and then you leave the area. So when you're fishing over a spear hole, when you're sight fishing, a lot of times just your movement will spook fish away. You got to be real quiet. You got to be real still when you're doing this. It's almost like fishing from a deer stand, I've called it in the past. So your movements make a big difference. When you set up a tip-up a ways away from you, it's a very stealthy approach, especially when you're in the shallows. Areas I like to set up tip-ups are when I have a shallow rock pile. Sometimes I'll put one up there. Another area that's one of my favorites is when you can find the corner or a point on a reed bed or a reed line. So the reeds that are sticking up out of the water or up out of the ice and snow, you'll see those lines of them. If I can find a point on those reeds, or I can find a nice corner, some area that just seems a little different, a little isolated, I'll put up a tip-up right along there. Sometimes if I can also see a long straightaway where the reeds are just going a long ways in a straight line, I'll set up right in the middle, because those fish will use those reeds as a runway and they'll just swim up and down those little runways, because a lot of times you'll find that where the reeds stop, it drops off and there will be like a nice little alley of sand from the reeds as it drops off and turns into cabbage. So setting up along those reeds is another great place. It's not just pike that you find there, you also find a lot of walleyes. Now, as far as presentations go, they're pretty specific. I don't get too wild on the different approaches towards fishing at first ice. Most often, especially early on, you know, those first few days before you get that first snow, which darkens things up underwater, the fish are pretty aggressive. So I like to go with a little more aggressive approaches on certain things like the walleyes. With the pike, I kind of do one thing and one thing only. I don't do much jigging for them. Usually what I'm doing is I'm just putting down a set line. So when I'm sight fishing below a spear hole, I'm putting a rod in a rod holder. I'll put like the bait feeder reel on so it can free spool. If you don't have that, you can use a bobber or figure out some other means of just keeping your bait up off of the bottom. But what I do is I just put down a big shiner or a medium sucker minnow on about a size 1 or 1/0 octopus hook, and I put it down about 1/3 of the way down the water column. So if I'm on a weed line that's in about 10 feet of water, I'm just going to put that minnow down about 3 feet below the ice. When you're sight fishing, it's a real rush, because you'll see these big pike come up right below your feet, right up to the spear hole, and you'll watch them inhale that minnow and then split. And that will get you going. It's one of the coolest experiences. It's a ton of fun. The other thing I'll do for the pike is I'll set up the tip-ups, and it's a similar deal. You can use the rod holder style tip-ups with the rod and reel, or you can use regular tip-ups. But generally I'm just doing the same thing. I'm putting a minnow down about 1/3 of the way down the water column. The water's typically pretty clear at this time. It can be dirty, but typically it's fairly clear enough for them. You get it down 1/3 of the way. When those fish are cruising over the tops of the weeds, they see that bait up above their head from a long ways away. They'll come over and they'll grab it. So a lot of times I talk about fishing 1 or 2, 3 feet off of the bottom. This is one of the rare exceptions where I'm fishing just a couple feet below the ice. In recent years, I've refined my approach. I've gotten away from leaders. I don't really use the quick strike rigs anymore. I like to use a single hook, like a number 1 or a 1/0 octopus hook. And I like to put it on just a medium-sized sucker minnow or a big shiner minnow, just about a 6-inch minnow. I've gotten away from using the really big baits. They don't seem to get me bigger bites. They don't seem to catch me any more fish, but they do seem to reduce the amount of hookups and the amount of bites that I get throughout the day. So going with the smaller minnow, going with the single hook, that's definitely got me more bites. The other thing I've done is I've gotten away from wire leaders. I always used to use a wire leader. Now what I do is I tie on a fluorocarbon leader. I just use a line to leader knot to my main line, so I get a 20-pound braid for my main line, and then I tie on a 20-pound fluorocarbon leader, and I just tie it together with an Alberto knot. So it's very minimalistic, just a small knot. It comes through the guides nice and easy. My leader is about 6 feet long, so typically I don't have any line down the hole that these fish can see. And it's tied directly to just that single hook put on that minnow. That smaller minnow, what I found is those fish can inhale it pretty quickly, and they get it in their mouth. As soon as they hit it, generally you can set the hook with the smaller minnow. A lot of times those quick strike rigs, you're putting those 2 treble hooks on both sides of that big minnow, and the purpose is you can set the hook quick, you know, as the name implies, quick strike rig. With the single hook and smaller minnow, these pike out here are typically pretty good size. When they come up and take the bait, you can generally hit them right away. Now during the day, in between pike, the way I like to kind of break things up is you're not going to be on constant action doing this with the pike fishing. Anytime you're dealing with the apex predators, it's going to be fish here and there. It's typically not real fast. But what I like to do to kind of break the day up is jig for perch. Just about anywhere you go in the bays, you're going to find a ton of perch. Most of them are going to be small. Most of them are going to be tiny. But they kind of break up the monotony. They give you something to do. What I've found is if you stick with them and just continue to fish for them throughout the day, if you're looking for a meal of fish, a lot of times you'll find that you can get some fish in that 8.5, 9-inch range, kind of those borderline keeper size perch. So if you're hungry and want to bring some fish home, you can get some keeper size perch. Occasionally you get into good ones doing this, but that's more of the exception than it is the rule. For the perch, all I'm doing is just using a tungsten jig and a light action rod. The rod I like, it's just the 30-inch light action, kind of a noodle tip rod. 4-pound test line and a little tungsten jig, like a 4mm gold tungsten jig. All I do is ball it up with bugs. You can put waxworms, you can put Eurolarva on it. I personally like the Eurolarva, the spikes, best because especially when you're dealing with little perch, they tend to rob you constantly. The Eurolarva stay on the hook a lot better than a waxworm. So going with the Eurolarva, be it red, white, multicolor, it doesn't really matter. But ball a bunch of those on there, catch as many fish as you want. Usually you find that the perch can keep you pretty busy throughout the day. And to go along with that, I don't think it hurts anything to have all the commotion of the perch being around your area, you catching them, bringing them up the hole. I think that can add a certain amount of attractiveness to the area and draw some pike in. And lastly is the walleye bite. Now, while I may be fishing for perch during the daytime, I always keep a spoon handy with a minnow head on it ready to go. You never know when a walleye might just cruise by. I see them occasionally throughout the day, and generally when they're cruising during the daytime, they're aggressive. They'll hit what you put down there. Sometimes they'll come up and look at my pike minnow. Sometimes it's a little too far away. I just think maybe it kind of goes unnoticed by them. But if I put a spoon down there, especially a flutter spoon, I really like flutter spoons earlier in the season when fish are aggressive. When I put a flutter spoon down there with a minnow head on it, even if that fish is already past my hole, a few quick jigs on that, good flutters coming up and down 2 or 3 feet, a lot of times will turn that fish around and draw them back in. And usually when I see a walleye swim through during the day, they're aggressive, they're looking to feed, they're looking to eat, and they'll come and hit that flutter spoon with a minnow head on it very readily. Most of the time, however, I don't see a lot of walleyes during the day. I usually see those at the end of the day in the evening. Now, if it's overcast out or if there's a lot of snow on the ice already where it's gotten dark down the hole, you may find that they start coming in a little bit earlier where you can still see them down the hole. Other days where the sun is out and it's a little bit brighter, it might be later in the day before they kind of activate and start searching around for food. It might be pretty dark down the hole before you first start seeing them. Either way, what I've noticed is the best bite is when things are typically getting pretty dark down the hole, but you can still see a little bit of what's going on. Oftentimes you can see their eyes or the little whites on their fins moving around down there. That seems to be the best hour for walleyes. In the evening, there's 2 main techniques that I'm using to get the walleyes, and number 1 is going to be the jigging spoon. I love a flutter spoon. There's a lot of good flutter spoons on the market. Typically what I'm going to go with is something that's like glow in the dark on one side or silver or gold, you know, some sort of chrome color on the back side. You get some flash, you get some glow. It's a great pattern throughout the year. It's just a walleye getter, you know, that chartreuse or white glow with just the gold or the silver back on it. You can't go wrong at any time during the season, whether it's bright out, whether it's cloudy out. You just cover a lot of bases with that simple color pattern. But the flutter spoon early on, it's got a lot of action. It draws fish in from a long ways away. It's got a lot of flash. It's displacing a lot of water. It's got a lot of different movements going on. It's just one of my favorites right away at the beginning of the season. I put a minnow head on it, I jig it fairly aggressively. Once I see fish come in, or if I'm using electronics because it's a little too dark and I start to notice them come in, I typically tame it down a little bit. Now some days they want you to just keep jigging aggressively, popping it up a foot off the bottom and letting it flutter down. Other days you find that you gotta jig pretty aggressively until they come in, and then once they come in, you gotta do little twitches and just make it kind of dance right in front of their nose. The second thing I'm doing for the walleyes is simply keeping a set line down. You know, for the pike, you're using that big shiner minnow, or you're using that medium-sized sucker, or you're using about a 6-inch minnow. Now, you can use that for the walleyes. You'll definitely catch some fish on those baits. But if you really want to set up more specific for the walleyes, what you'll do is on your second line at dark, you'll pull that big minnow up and you'll put down something smaller, like a big rainbow minnow, something like a 4-inch minnow, like a big fathead, a big rainbow minnow, or a smaller shiner, like a 3 to a 4-inch shiner. Those are going to be more of the walleye baits in the evening. Now you kind of got to play a little bit of a decision game. Do I want to continue looking for a giant pike? Because sometimes they'll move around in the evening. Or do I want to just double down on the walleyes and put 2 walleye baits down there? That's a choice you're going to have to make. But, you know, if you're fishing that jig and spoon and the walleyes are coming in pretty regularly, might not be a bad idea to go ahead and put that second walleye rod down there. So even with the limited accessibility of First Ice, there's still some really incredible opportunities for some trophy northern pike, some good evening walleye action, as well as some perch during the daytime to just break things up a little bit. So if you're looking to get out on Mille Lacs, do a little research, try to find an area where weeds, that 10 foot of water weed line is going to meet up with a hard bottom, such as a point. Find an area like that, have a couple rods ready, have something set up, a set line for the pike, have a walleye spoon ready, and have a tungsten jig ready for the perch to keep you busy during the day. Those things right away at First Ice can really provide a lot of entertainment and a lot of fun, and occasionally can provide some trophy northern pike that first couple weeks of the season. So stay safe as you go out, wear your ice picks, wear some cleats. It can be really slippery out there. Keep a spud bar in front of you, check the ice as you go. Good luck fishing, and I hope these tips help you out.